Hello and welcome to the Museum of North Idaho's author interview with Ryan. How do I say your last name? Is it Pilgrim?
Pilgrim.
Pilgrim. Ah, I've overcomplicated
I know
it.
it looks more complicated than it is.
So we're discussing your book, Pushed Out, and it's about the development and rural gentrification, which I'm hoping that we will get that very well defined. I think it's a relevant topic throughout all of North Idaho. And so I'm excited to hear what you have to tell us about the results of what has happened in Dover, Idaho. And I think we're going to see a lot of connections for Kootenai County and not just Bonner.
I mean, that's the idea, is that, and hopefully I will do a good job defining all my terms. And I'm a teacher, so I encourage people in the audience to ask questions in the chat, and so that I can answer them if to clarify or whatever. Yes, I'm talking about my book tonight, Pushed Out. I'm an associate professor at the University of Idaho, and I've been here for 11 years now. So this is a project that looks at Dover, Idaho as a sort of case study of change in the rural West, and looking at Dover at how it exemplifies certain changes that we've seen, and trying to understand that from a sociological perspective. I'm a sociology professor. So just a tiny bit of background as we get started. Dover, Idaho was home to a large sawmill that operated from about 1920 to the late 1989. It was closed and then it burned down. And that site, the mill site, sat vacant until about 2005, when the city council rezoned it from agricultural to a planned use development. Because Dover was rezoned, it was jolted almost overnight from a sort of sleepy community with a church and post office to a, quote, unique upscale development consisting of 11 distinct neighborhoods offering waterfront custom homes. And this cover image, I've used a lot. I was excited when they chose it as the editors chose it as cover image. I think it sort of exemplifies some of this change we're seeing in the West. So just in case you don't know where Dover is, there's a map here for you. So up on Lake Pend Oreille, kind of where the lake outlets into the river. And just for a little context, here's the Dover Community Hall and the old railroad bridge that used to go over the tracks right outside of Dover. So I didn't exactly grow up in Dover. I grew up in sort of a no man's land on Chuck Slough between Sandpoint and Dover. But I rode the Dover school bus, and so I got to know a lot of the Dover kids. And so my family moved to Dover from Montana, from a ranching community. And it just so happened that because I rode the Dover bus and got to know a lot of the Dover kids, that many of my most memorable, like, high school child experiences happened there. So I had my first car accident in Dover. I had my first kiss in Dover. Was in my first BB gun war in Dover. And when my friends' parents both passed away, very suddenly and unexpectedly when we were quite young. It's where we had our sort of first memorial and tried to learn how to grieve. So I also think it's kind of interesting. So I brought this nice bridge up. One of the people I interviewed had been a dispatcher for the bus. Her husband happened to be the former mayor of Dover. And she said that on occasion, 2-foot chunks of the asphalt, like the size of like a table, sort of like a small table, would fall away and leave just gaping holes to fall. She said she lived in fear that school buses were gonna kind of tippy canoe off the bridge and into the onto the railroad tracks. And I bring this up because one of the things I'm going to talk a lot about today is infrastructure, and the ways that infrastructure and infrastructural decline sort of exacerbates inequalities and things like gentrification. So just so you have an idea of what we're going to do tonight, I think I'm supposed to keep this to around 30 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes, ask some questions. My plan is to read about 4 minutes from the introduction to the book in the beginning, and then at the end, read a little bit from the conclusion. But try and really focus on some of the more historical context that leads up to what we're going to be talking about today. And forgive me, I'm going to be sort of shuffling between screens as I do that. So we'll just see how we do this here. So let's see. Okay. Technology never fails me. Okay, so reading from a little bit from the introduction here. Okay. So hopefully maybe you can see that a little bit. So every month the Dover girls meet to share a potluck lunch and work on a project at the community hall. One of this week's projects was making blankets for what one of them termed, quote, abused women. The Dover girls, a group of older women who grew up there, had spent a lifetime together as friends and neighbors, raising children and bearing husbands. So sharing the afternoon with them felt like being let in on a secret. The women teased and joked, filling and refilling their plates with casseroles, salads, rolls, and desserts, and encouraged me to do the same. They were completely at ease with each other. After lunch, they got to work on their tasks, sewing dresses to send to Africa and making blankets for a domestic violence shelter. There was a matter-of-factness to the discussion. They were making blankets for the women because, as Sharon Miller, who was in her 80s and had lived in Dover since she was a child, explained, when men are laid off at Christmas time, they tend to drink too much and knock women around. The community hall hosting this event, along with most of the other homes and buildings in this town, was originally built for a different mill town in the area. But when that mill burned down in 1922, the mill's owner, A.C. White, sent a flotilla of buildings upriver to the site of a new mill that would eventually become Dover, Idaho. If the burnt orange percolating coffee pot was any indication, the community hall, like much of Old Dover, hadn't seen many changes since the buildings were moved. The walls were the soft industrial green that had gone out of style, but is now back in fashion. In places, large swaths of green paint was bubbling and peeling away, a sign of water damage and age. But what stood out were the photos that lined the walls. Black and white photos of children in overalls standing before now forgotten schoolhouse, photos of the old lumber mill before it closed in the late 1800s or 1980, photos of long dead but not forgotten Doverites who'd made their home on the shores of the river. In one, children are dressed in costumes on stage for a local production. In another, long tables of people enjoying the town's annual picnic, with the church and the lake serving as a backdrop. The Dover girls laugh as they point out their husbands as children in the now 80-year-old photos. The old Dover was born again in the photos that had been carefully preserved and captioned. These photos highlight what was special about Dover to the community. The beauty of Lake Pend Oreille and the Pend Oreille River and Lake Pend Oreille was never far from their minds, but it mostly served as the backdrop for the relationships that flourished in this place. The bluff, the beach, and the endless fields and forests are meaningful, but primarily because they provided a space to labor and connect with the community. At the end of the community hall, a birdhouse decorated with ivy and moss served as a donation box. A cheerful handwritten sign explains, quote, donations for gas and light. A reminder that we might not have much, but if we pull together, we still have this place. Most of the windows in the community hall face Old Dover, still looking over the original mill workers' houses and churches that were transported up the river in 1922. Slipping into the kitchen and peering out the back window, however, is a reminder of how much Dover has changed. In the 1950s, it would have looked out a tangle of trees, then into a deep meadow in the distance, and the community's sandy beach just beyond that. Later, the view would have included massive piles of wood chips, the birch trees providing some cover between the building and the graying piles of sawdust. Today, there's a walking path that skirts the back of the community hall, and beyond that, brand new homes. Dozens of buildings, from condominiums to bungalows to massive mansions, now sit in the fields where the mill once stood, adorned with natural wood shingles and crisp white trim. The homes share a familiar similar architectural style, meant to evoke the craftsman style that was popular when the buildings of Old Dover were floating up the river. But the homes are unmistakably modern in their attempt to blend the ruggedness of the Pacific Northwest with the comforts of upper middle class living. Lining freshly paved streets, the new homes nestle against the development's headquarters, which features a fitness club and an upscale restaurant. The development was approved in 2004 after a lengthy and contentious struggle with the inhabitants of Old Dover. Since then, New Dover has brought waves of people to the community, drawn by the scenic beauty and recreational potential of the river and adjoining lake. When looking out the window of Old Dover Community Hall, the new homes are so close it seems like you might be able to peer inside. But the new homes are built with their backs to the community center so that they face the lake. And so it is, new and old, back to back, a path winding between them.
That's one of my favorite lines, new and old, back to back.
Yeah,
So-
really, thank you. It was
Yeah.
fun to write a book, but I have never done it before, so.
That imagery was really powerful when I read it.
Thank you. I feel like I'm better at writing than giving presentations.
You're doing great.
So I just, okay. So I wanted to just bring up some concepts that are important that I'll probably, words I'm going to be using a lot to make sure that I've made it clear what those are. So this project is a case study, which means I think it exemplifies something interesting about a phenomena. So it's not to say that this is the most important site of gentrification or the only site of gentrification. It's to say that I'm going to look very, very deeply at one place to try and understand that place, and then maybe to see if I can understand phenomena and social structures more broadly from that place. And one of the phenomena that I was particularly interested in studying is rural gentrification. So rural gentrification is said to require, so I have some definitions here that I pulled from the literature, but it's said to require two elements. So one is a demographic shift of population from urban and suburban areas to rural ones. And the second is the influx of a population of people with social and economic power to rural areas where they're able to assert that power. So we could think about, my brother works in the oil fields, or he did in Eastern Montana. And certainly there's been a population change over there, but it probably wouldn't be called rural gentrification, because I'm not sure that the oil workers would be considered to have maybe social power there. The other idea that I'm going to be talking a little bit about today is the idea of the New West. So it describes sort of the cultural and economic shift in the West from extractive industries to more, I'm trying to summarize this quickly, to more migrant populations focused on tourism. I think this quote's particularly interesting. Included in New West images are ranchers, horses, and dusty cattle drives. Today, the New West conveys images of residents wearing Patagonia fleece and Western jeans, telecommuters, and professionals with laptops able to work remotely. Right, so the Old West and the New West, and thinking about them in terms of rural gentrification. I think it's also interesting that I did all my research, so I did all my research starting in 2016. I had a small grant through the University of Idaho to do it. So I thought it was particularly timely at that point, given some of the political divisions in our country, thinking about what maybe is at the heart of some of those, or what do they look like in rural communities. I think sometimes we oversimplify what we're seeing. And then COVID hit, right? And so I think this wasn't written with Zoom towns in mind or sort of that telecommuting in mind, but I think it's really applicable. These ideas are particularly salient right now, and I think the book speaks to them in really interesting ways, personally. So the book is primarily based on archival data and interviews. So I did over 30 interviews with new residents, old residents, people involved in decision-making, the developers, state geologists, cultural resource manager for the Kalispel tribe. I did significant archival research at the Bonner Historical Society. And then there were some wonderful folks in Dover who lent me their sort of family archives, which was very, very helpful. Lots of city council meetings. I use archaeological site reports, and then just spending time with people in the community. I will say everybody in this book has a pseudonym. That was a decision that was really difficult to make. Some people really would like to be named, and I think they have a right to be named. They have really important stories to tell. But because some people I interviewed wanted to be anonymous and some wanted to be named, it just started to get really complicated. Certain places in the community also I've used pseudonyms for them, because in my ideal world, there'll be people reading this book from all over the place, not just North Idaho. And it's not really supposed to be a book exactly about North Idaho. It's supposed to be a book about how this one particular place might tell us something more broadly. Okay, so one of them, then we're almost to the fun part, once I give you sort of the meat and potatoes. So this project is roughly, or kind of uses David Harvey's theory of the spatial fix. So Harvey argues that capitalism seeks out new spaces and workers to function, right? So it has to create a space, and then it has to destroy that space when it's no longer possible to profit there. And then once it's destroyed, wealth can come back in and profit there. So one of the things I've done here is I've numbered these, I've sort of summarized his argument and numbered it for you. And what I'll be doing throughout the talk is trying to sort of give you guideposts like, oh, here we're in phase 1, and now you can see phase 2, and now you'll see phase 3. Okay, so what's at stake? Why did this shift happen? What was the response to it? So ultimately, I'm interested in understanding the mechanisms for rural gentrification. Dover is interesting to me, in part because I grew up there, but also because the city council actually had a fair amount of power to stop the development through rezoning. And one of the questions that really drove this research for me when I started was, why would they do that, right? These are working class people, blue and pink collar workers. Why would they rezone their community? It didn't make sense to me. And I became sort of obsessed with answering that question because I thought if I could answer that question, I might be able to say something more broadly about rural gentrification. The answer in Dover is so interesting and specific. In particular, I'm not sure it does, but I think it does tell us something about power dynamics for sure. So I want to start the story here. I think we need to be careful with ideas about rural gentrification and the title of the book Pushed Out, which by the way, I didn't get to pick, but because it implicitly posits loss is starting in 1980 when the mill closes, right? But clearly for Indigenous people in the West, this loss started much earlier and has been profound in scope. So the mill could move to Dover in 1922 because the Kalispel people were forced out. The Kalispel Nation and the Army Corps of Engineers note that the Kalispel people wintered precisely at the location where the mill is located for at least 2,000 years. They were finally removed from the land in about 1930 by way of the way state hunting laws were enforced. And one of the things that was really interesting in my interviews with some of the old timers in Dover is that some of them remembered their trading with the Kalispel people when they were children, trading buckskins for moccasins. So step 1. So first, this is the Kalispel people's primarily homeland. It was on the watershed, or it and continues to be on the watershed of Lake Pend Oreille and the Pend Oreille watershed. There's a little picture in the corner. It's the sturgeon nose canoes that the Kalispel people use are so specialized at navigating the reeds and winds of our region that there's only 2 other tribes in the entire world that use this type of canoe. But by 1890, they would find the lake and rivers crossed by railroad bridges and filled with logs felled for timber. The Northern Pacific Railway had lobbied the US government for subsidies to construct the rail line, and they were given 40 million acres of land. For every mile of track they built, the federal government handed over 12,800 acres, and it was double that in the territories. And just maybe keep the picture of that little graphic picture in the left-hand corner in your mind, because I'm going to mention it in a little bit here in the future. So records from the Humboldt Mill, which was in Sandpoint, but close to Dover, show that the mill owner there acquired 159,000 acres of timberland from 1901 to 1910, paying an average of $5.60 an acre. And I don't know, I have 3 kids and they're always like, well, it was the olden times. That's not that much money, Mom. Or that was a lot of money back then. So for comparison, you could buy 2, quote, universal wolf tooth forceps for extracting wolf teeth, or 3 ventilated false beards on a wire for $6 from the Sears and Roebuck catalog at the time. Right, so for the same price, you could buy an acre of land or 3 false beards. In other words, unimaginably huge chunks of land were essentially given away to the already rich and well-connected. Weyerhaeuser, think timber, would end up buying a significant amount of this land from the Northern Pacific Railroad. Weyerhaeuser was also a very close personal friend and neighbor of the railroad baron James Hill, also known as the Empire Builder. So as soon as the line is complete, the Northern Pacific begins advertising to potential settlers in a sort of guidebook published by Rand McNally, telling them about that the railroad has about 2 million acres in northern Idaho and extolling the beauty of Lake Pend Oreille. The little sketch in the previous picture was one of the sketches that was in the Rand McNally guide trying to encourage settlers to come. I think it's also interesting, I can't help but go back, that there's a lot of there's bluffs in the background. It looks in a lot of ways a lot like Dover. So I was really struck by that image. Okay. So this story largely starts out at the turn of the 20th century, but it's obviously embedded in a much longer history. Chapter 2 of my book is called A Brief History of the Last 62 Million Years. And it looks primarily at the geological, indigenous, and 20th century history of the Pend Oreille watershed. In Dover, the community was literally barged upstream to its current location when a fire burnt down the mill in Laclede, 10 miles downstream, and a new mill was established in Dover by the same person who'd owned the mill in Laclede. So why were all these mills here? So there's the Northern Pacific Railway is building a rail line. They're given tons of land. That land is being bought up by railroad or by timber mills. And at the time, mills tended to own the timber they were logging. And then they would, once it was logged, they would sell off that land to farmers. Some really interesting history about the amount of dynamite that was sold in North Idaho to blow up all the stumps to clear the land for farming, like amazing amounts of dynamite. But who's working in these? I don't know if anyone's read the new novel, out of Spokane. Anyway, talks a lot about all this. It's really interesting. So lured by work, thousands of mostly new immigrants showed up to do the work in these mills and in the woods. Working conditions in the lumber camps were terribly dangerous. Deaths were quite common. In the book, I have a fair number of quotes from some of the old timers whose dads and uncles had worked in the woods and lost limbs and even died doing it. The living conditions for the men were abysmal. They worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. The dining hall was a bright spot of the lumber or the logging camps, but betrayed the demands of the job. The USDA recommended that men consume 8,000 calories a day to keep up their work. A recommended breakfast included oatmeal mush, donuts, rye bread, corn syrup, cornmeal cookies made with corn syrup, apple butter, cream potatoes, coffee, and codfish cakes. That was all for one meal. After supper, the men could look forward to retiring to bunkhouses filled with wooden bed frames. They had to bring their own straw to fill the beds and sheets to make them. They were filled with lice. The camps typically had no running water and nowhere to wash themselves for the entire winter. Years later, men could still describe the stench of a bunkhouse when the men would remove their wet socks in the evening, unwashed for an entire season, to dry by the fire. All right. By the late 1910s, the radical industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, worked and organized in the region to try and create a single union allied against the capitalist class. Their work in northern Idaho focused on a fight for an 8-hour workday. When timber workers in northern Idaho weren't successful in their demands after a long strike in the summer of 1918, they used industrial sabotage as part of their strike at work programs, where equipment and timber is destroyed and they simply quit working after 8 hours. Workers in Dover became embroiled with the Wobblies, and short logs were found in Dover in increasing numbers in between 1917 and 1919. And despite 20 workers standing trial for their involvement with the Wobblies, lumber workers in North Idaho do win an 8-hour workday, a 48-hour work week, time and a half overpay. They also win better working conditions at both the mills and logging camps, steel bunks, clean beds, electric lights, showers, and laundries. I always think that part of Idaho history is really important, the labor history of North Idaho. Here's some pictures of Dover, the school that was built. They also built a school and a church, a community hall. It was kind of a wonderful time. In this period, like after they created their own public spaces. So kind of in the distance here, you can see on this bottom picture, you can see cars parked and the city beach was over there. This is the bluff they played on, and the rows of mill housing. So the mill also, and this is important, the mill also in Dover provided the water, the drinking water for the community. And it just was a really tight-knit, warm community. So here's one of the productions they put on, and their annual picnic, which is sort of still going in Dover, is a source of a lot of community pride. Dover only incorporated in 1989, so the census records around population are limited. But in 1990, they had a population of about 300. In 2000, it was a little less than 400. Today, or in 2010, we'll get the 2020 census soon, it's about 600. Part of that, of course, is that in the new development that was built, only about 80 or 20% of residents live there full time. So they're not included in the census counts of full-time residents. Okay. So
I didn't realize that, because I pulled some of the demographics from 2019, which is, I know is right before the census, and it had the population change from 2000 to 2019 increased by 155% of what the town was at, and the median income was 36,250 in 2000, and it jumped up to 81,099 in those 19 years. So I just wanted to take a break for the comments. Patricia Erickson says the Spokane book that was referenced is The Cool Millions by Jess Walter. And then Heather Brandstetter says the TV series Deadwood illustrates the progressive colonialism of the West, where the white pioneers push out the natives and then later controlled by the industry businessmen. So,
and I think these are such important parts of our history. I think Jess Walter's book, I read it and I've given it now to like 10 people who are circulating it around. I think we need these clear histories. We need to understand, we often have our idea of the Old West is not very accurate and it's not very clear, and it makes a very easy, like sort of nostalgic vision that we have. And it's hard to build from something when we don't have an accurate picture of the past, I think.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I didn't realize that we're not, the census doesn't count second homes, and there are
don't
those
quote me on
homes.
that, but and the number was
don't.
I don't think they do. The number was so low. I think you have to, it's kind of like where you're where they were counting who has corona and where. It's like that became kind of controversial, like up in North Idaho, I know, because for second homeowners, it was being counted in their first home, that kind of stuff. So you don't double count people, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so step one, we sort of create a space for capitalism, right? And it means this sort of settler colonialism, pushing out of the Kalispel people and really all indigenous people in the West into very limited and very sort of barbaric conditions, and under really barbaric conditions that, especially having gone to high school in Idaho, that we just don't talk about. I did most of my schooling in Montana, and I moved to Idaho, and I was having a conversation with someone recently, like, why don't we learn anything in Idaho? And why did I learn it in Montana? And they're like, well, it's in the Montana state constitution that they have to cover indigenous issues. And it's not in the Idaho state constitution. I was like, oh, you can tell. So I think part of me when I was writing this book was like, why didn't I know this thing? Why didn't I know about the Wobblies? Why didn't I know about the Kalispel tribe? Like, I sort of knew in the background that these things had to be important, but I think part of me was just driven to like feel like I knew the history of my own community more deeply. which is why I spent probably way too much time learning about the history of everything to contextualize it. Let's see, what time is it? Because I feel like I'm not going very quickly. Okay. So this all changes in the 1980s with a number of economic crises in extractive industries. So the most significant and least discussed cause of this downturn in timber is automation and consolidation. So we hear a lot about like, oh, the timber industry like went under and it was really scary. And we blame environmentalists. And I was like, okay, maybe that's the narrative, right? I'm a researcher. I'm open to the mysteries of the universe. So I sort of went in a deep dive into the history of mills in the 1970s and 80s and 90s and 2000s in Idaho. What I found was between 1979 and 2006, and I stopped in 2006 because that's when the big housing crisis and it really disrupted the whole timber industry. The number of the mills in the region in North Idaho shrank from 133 to 38, right? So that fits the narrative. However, the amount of timber produced in North Idaho actually increased in every reported period between 1979 and 2006, from about 900,000 board feet in 79 to 1.7 million board feet in 2006. So like almost a doubling between those periods. So these seeming contradictions that we have fewer mills but more lumber being produced are explained by the closure of small mills and the growth of much larger ones that required or that needed fewer people to do the same work because of the rapid mechanization in the industry. Like during this 60 years earlier, when workers' demand for fair compensation, the industry responded with rapid technological innovation to replace humans with machines. One researcher found, quote, nationwide during the 1980s, production in lumber mills rose by almost 2% a year, and employment decreased by 2% a year. And I was so surprised by all of that I like spent an inordinate amount of time making sure I actually was accurate, because it just was so contrary to the narrative I had heard growing up. And so these changes were dire for communities because it meant that not only was the entire region undergoing rapid economic change, but that when the mill in Dover closed, mills around the region were closing. And so were the mines, which had been a long standby for mill workers. Clarence Hill, one of the guys I interviewed, described the way even the parking lot changed. Quote, when I first came here, you could drive to town and the town would be full of pickup trucks because they're all working at the mill, at the Dover mill. Now you don't see so many pickup trucks, you see cars. Or you see pickup trucks that clearly are not being used for anything other than trying to make the occupant feel better about themselves. So in the course of about 60 years, the community is built up because of the timber industry, but certainly not in the way that's designed to maintain the community in the future. For the people who relied on the timber industry for work, blame mostly fell on the federal government for losses that were tied to federal standards to protect wildlife and fish. Particularly the spotted owl got a lot of attention. Researchers suggest that these changes actually resulted in fewer than 5% of job losses experienced in the timber industry, and that automation happened at the same time that the environmental movement gained a foothold in Northwest politics. And so that created a lot of sort of confusion about and misinformation about what was happening. I thought one of the things I found just sort of heartbreaking was that the mill in Dover unionized and about 6 months later closed. And then it burned down. So the city of Dover is dealing with really serious infrastructure problems at this time. So when the mill closes, they've provided water for the community of Dover. And one of the things that happens is the mill sends out a letter to Dover residents letting them know that when the mill was sold, after it was closed, that water was incidental to the purchase and they were no longer going to provide the community with water. So this is some of the wonderful archival data that some of the local people shared with me, right? So here you have this community, the mill closes, and all of a sudden you're told, and you're not going to have running water in your home anymore. The city of Dover, or the community of Dover, it was incidental to the purchase. That line just got me. This is incidental to our purchase. So here you have this community where they're being told they're not going to have water anymore. And this becomes a major crisis in Dover. So the mill was legally required to continue providing water to the community, it turns out, as long as people paid their bills. So even when I was doing interviews, people could pull out their bills from the 1980s with like their canceled checks still attached to it. You would pay a whole year's worth of water at once, but they were not required to maintain the water system. An engineering firm that came out and looked at the water system in Dover said that it was not really a water system. It was akin to something you would see in a third world country. The pipes were wooden. They had been run over, dug up. There was basically a creek running from the water tower. It was leaking so bad. And then here's a picture of the city councilor turned mayor, turned citizen back at some point. When the power would go out, the pump house would stop, the pump house would flood. They would have to bail out all the water and then try and get the pump moving again. And this is just local people trying to keep the water running. The city of Dover was under a boil order for 6 years. And during parts of that, they had no running water. The joke, this is from an interview, the joke in Sandpoint was, flush your toilet, Dover needs water. In fact, part of the reason the mill burned down was that the city of Dover, that there was no water to pump for the firefighters to hook up to put the fire out. They had to eventually put the water in the lake, or put their hoses in the lake to draw water to get the fire out. But it's not just that they're under a boil order for 6 years and that the mill burns down. It's also that their sewer system was put under a red tag order. So the bridge is failing, they don't have water, their jobs are closing, and then the sewer system is red tagged. And what that meant was that they were basically putting effluent sewage into the watershed at certain times of the year. And also that they could not build any new homes in their community. So there was no new homes allowed. So the city once again did what they had done with their water system, and go out and get loans for low-income communities grants to rebuild these systems. When they went to get their new sewer system put in, they needed somewhere to put the sewer system. So they tried to use eminent domain to take about 12 acres of the mill site so they could build a sewer system. And the developer, mill owner at that time, they're sort of one and the same, refused to sell them at market rate. And so they'd sell it to them for like $1 million, and they didn't have $1 million. So the developer and the city of Dover ended up in a court battle, and a judge required that the city rezone the community in order to buy the land to put their sewer system at the market rate. So no one really got a choice in the matter about what happened. In order to rebuild their infrastructure, they were essentially forced to rebuild this, or to rezone the community. And it's interesting to consider that the mill owners basically abdicated their responsibility to provide clean drinking water to the community. They used loans for low-income communities to rebuild that system. Then they forced the city to rezone so that they could have somewhere to build their sewer plant. And part of that required that they make the sewer plant big enough for the homes on the development. And one of the things that struck me throughout all this is these were grants for low-income communities that the city was forced to get because the mill owners abdicated responsibility, right? So you build a space for capitalism, you destroy it. By destroying the infrastructure, they created opportunities to create this development. The crisis for things that create crises for working people become opportunities for people with wealth. And I think that that's something that's important to sort of consider when we're thinking about the market. I know we're sort of out of time, so I'm just gonna maybe.
You're doing okay.
Okay. I think I'll just read a little bit from the conclusion, because those I think are some of the high points. And then maybe we could go to questions. Obviously, I've written an entire book about this, so I have a lot to say. Okay. So Mill Lake is a simulacra for an American West that never existed. Mill Lake is old-timey street lamps and fountains set against the scenic beauty of the river and the mountains. Mill Lake is a sparkling new Dover City Hall that sits at the lake's edge with vaulted ceilings and exposed beams, showing off timber that one time would have been harvested by Dover residents and processed at the Dover Mill, but today probably came from Canada. Mill Lake means realtors rushing around looking for the omnipresent moose to entice buyers with what they call a Mill Lake moment, hoping that the moose doesn't charge when they find it. What's missing from the simulacra, of course, are the people of Old Dover, who, in small and large ways, are erased from the community. Each single change is magnified against the backdrop of historic changes. Today in Old Dover, a maroon 4-H bus sits in someone's yard. It's half storage unit and half garden statue, a reminder of a time when a small community could fill a bus with kids and head to a neighborhood community equally full of kids. In Mill Lake, streets are named after old-timers whose families settled in Dover 100 years ago, but whose children cannot afford to live on the streets that bear their names. What happened in Dover is happening across the Pacific Northwest and the American West more broadly. Communities that undergo processes like this are sometimes referred to as lucky, since the alternative in the American West is to essentially be erased off the map. The winners of these processes talk about rural revitalization, but the process is inherently uneven. Wealth only returns to areas that were previously exploited in a boom and bust cycle by people who accumulated wealth elsewhere. When wealth returns, it must extract the resources of the community again. Now, instead of clearing timber, workers clear tables, and they fight to survive in an especially exploitive service economy, in which Idaho law in 2020 sets the minimum wage for tip workers at $3.35 an hour. For the residents of Old Dover, this doesn't necessarily feel like a revitalization. I think I'll end there.
As we wait for some questions, I wrote a note similar to your end note that the jobs created by the hospitality industry increased the Alice population instead of the well-paying jobs of the resource extraction that you were mentioning, which is mining and timber industries. So
yeah, and I should have, there was one thing, let's see, I wanted to, okay. I think this is sort of an important note. I think I meant to read more. Sometimes the anger that old timers feel at the injustice of the system find its way to environmentalists, despite evidence indicating that the timber companies competing in a global market themselves abandon these communities in order to profit elsewhere. The anger is amplified by those who claim that tourist-based economies are more environmentally sound than extractive industries, which is a debatable claim. But more importantly, such claims suggest that the human suffering of people left behind is an acceptable price to pay to protect the natural world. It suggests that having a beautiful place to tootle around on a motorboat or ski is more important than people's ability to provide for their families. Against these debates, it bears repeating that the market is not a natural force. These practices and policies that we loosely call the free market are anything but free, and were created by the people who benefit from them in order for their interests to seem natural. Across time and throughout history, most people have lived in arrangements that did not lead to these kind of boom and bust cycles that have gripped the American West. And it is possible to create a future that does not rely on them.
wonderful. So during your interview, you were at the community hall. So there are residents that are staying in Dover that are long timers. So are they in their original homes? And I have to ask, do they have anything to say about the property taxes for?
Yeah. I think they have many things to say about many things, and most of them are quite circumspect and careful in how they think about things. I think so. One of the hallmarks of rural gentrification compared to urban gentrification is that rural gentrification tends to lead to intergenerational displacement. So, which is a long way of saying, yeah, they're staying in their homes because they're mostly paid off. They've lived there for a long time. but their kids can't live there and their grandkids can't live there. Even one of the residents, one of the stories that really, there were many stories that made me feel really sad when I was writing, but one of them was their granddaughter wanted to put a trailer on their property. They have a huge lot, and the sewer hookup alone was going to be $15,000. Right. So even being part of she couldn't afford even the infrastructure to stay in the community. I thought of like, and these are people who, one of the things that made Dover really special to the people of Dover was that people had grown up. There were many, many generations of people who grew up together, grandparents, parents, grandkids, aunts, uncles, like everyone is related by 2 degrees, and there's so much camaraderie, and their kids can't stay there. And there was less, I talk a little bit in the conclusion about property taxes because they had gone up so much, but it was things like some of the things that I think were the most distressing to them were the water and sewer prices had gone up dramatically. They couldn't launch boats anymore without paying a fee. And they had been under the impression when the development was built, most of them had gotten the impression that they would be able to do that. They had had a community beach for 100 years that they had all used, that they really thought should have stayed with the city or with the community of Dover. But it was one of the, first lots that was sold. So watching these spaces that were really, really significant to them, and that just became private property, was really painful.
All right, so we have some questions. One is, so what could the city council have done differently?
I don't think anything. I mean, one person I interviewed said, when I asked him that question, said like, be rich and hire a really good lawyer. And I think that's, I think when I started the book, that's what I wanted to answer. That's one of the questions I wanted to answer. And it became really clear that this is not, I don't think this is a problem we can solve locally exactly. We are participating in global economic forces. We are experiencing those global economic forces, but then we also have a hard time understanding them as global, and we try and understand them as like deeply local. And I think they both are. I don't think the city council really could have done too much, especially like when you just look at all the documents and what was happening. I mean, the judge decided what was going to happen. It was really hard for me to believe, like I had done all this and I just found this like document, like that's it. That's the story. It seemed so big, and it's and in some ways it's not very helpful for other communities. But I think one of the chapters in the book really looks at, there was a significant resistance, not necessarily by the old timers, but by a group of Dover people in community, about a dozen people who worked extremely hard to fight against the development. And they tried to use the bureaucracy against the developer, essentially, like bringing in the Army Corps of Engineers, bringing in the wild, and I think one of the points of the book is that those systems aren't actually designed to protect communities, maybe individual landowners, but we don't think about the way we organize and think about space, especially in Idaho, is very much like around individual interests and not about community interests. And that was a weird sort of needle to thread, I think, for somewhere like where people in Dover like really believed in their own individual property rights, but on the other hand, had shared these common spaces and seen that work really well in their community. And they were trying to find sort of a middle ground for that.
And did you find in your research how communities can transition their small rural towns without pushing out the residents and their descendants?
No, and that's the next book I want to write. So if anyone in the audience has an ideal community in mind, my goal is to try to identify 4 or 5, because that was one of the things that people are going to ask me, how do you fix this? What is this? What is another option? And not everyone's like, well, the economic system needs to be, what are some examples? And so that's kind of one of my goals. I mean, I think part of it is, and this is going to I'm going to sound too much like a college professor, but Wallerstein has this theory, world systems theory, right? That like you can think about the whole world as like an economic scale, and that the core countries, like developed countries, pull from undeveloped, or he calls them peripheral countries, to shore up their economic interests, right? That it's like a one-way flow. And I think you could kind of use that theory and apply it like regionally or nationally, right? What's happening in rural communities often is that we're extracting resources from them and not bringing in enough labor. I don't know. So I don't even know where I'm going with that. I think like you have to think it like it's these big global problems. But when you think about like communities that work, they're often like, I live in Moscow. It's a very like, it's a really interesting and wonderful community in a lot of ways. We also have a ton of state money that comes into Moscow that allows the community, that kind of buffers the community, right? So we can think about like when education is a resource that kind of buffers the community, in part because we have that flow of state dollars into our community, which some people think is kind of problematic, but it does help our economy. And I think maybe certain agricultural communities that have very stable markets could be good examples too, that it's an extractive industry that if it's able to protect itself can be pretty successful. Like I look at some of the communities on the Palouse that are wheat communities, although we've seen the same consolidation in agriculture that we see in timber and most other industries.
We have a question. Did you interview any of the new Dover residents?
I did. Yep. I interviewed probably, I'm trying to think, maybe 10 new Dover residents. I mean, I think I had a selection bias because I was interviewing people who live there year round. And the people who, I mean, the way I got my list of people, I think like they were part of a charity group. So they were, I think, particularly community minded. They were wonderful. And it was interesting because, and I think one of the things I've worked hard at doing in the book, like this is in the book about like some people are real jerks and some people are like saints, right? It's that we live within these sort of economic and political forces, and it's sometimes hard to see other people's interests in that. And I think they sort of didn't realize how contentious the development process was, and they didn't, I think, weren't totally attuned to that, but certainly some of them were. One of the people I interviewed in the development had been volunteering at the Historical Society, organizing all the pictures in Dover. So I thought there was like an interesting parallel that this resource that I was using was well organized because one of these newcomers had been interested in the community and had gone and done all this research. And they were some of the people who had pointed out some of the things that they found very distressing. Most of them had come from communities with, I guess, different labor rights. They were like, some of these guys are out building out in the weather. You know, the only day that they didn't even take Thanksgiving off, they've been out here all winter building on that roof. Like, shouldn't they get vacations? And so, you know, I think we can't tell simple stories about communities.
How is the second home, is that something that's incredibly popular in Dover?
I think so. I mean, so I did my interviews in 2016. So my information is accurate for that. But at the time, it was when I was interviewing, the estimates were 70 to 80% of people were second homeowners. So only 20 to 30% of people were there year round.
Wow. That is...
And I think interestingly, I don't know this for sure, but in my interviews, there was a selection bias in terms of the people who are living there year round were people living in like the more modest condominiums and not the big homes.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I see you, Heather. You said you were looking for another town maybe to study, and she's suggested her hometown of Wallace.
Oh, Wallace is interesting.
She said affordable housing is a problem for the service economy, wages, and that they have difficulty finding housing for workers that are needed in the service industry. And I know that that's something that even Coeur d'Alene is feeling, that the hospitality industry, like, you cannot afford to live in Coeur d'Alene, but that is where the work is at. She also wrote the Airbnbs are another problem that they're having in Wallace. And they have been talking about an occupancy tax to deal with that, setting up land trusts and enacting historic preservation zoning, but it's hard to see where they can go next.
Yeah, I think I just got an email from a guy in upstate New York who's on the city council. It's like, do you have anything about that? What should I do about this? What kind of laws can we write? And, nobody is doing this kind of research yet. I think, unfortunately, research is sometimes behind kind of the curve, right? We see it happening and then we collect the data and it takes a long time to get it in but absolutely, there's so many communities, there's so many people I've heard talk about that, because it really distorts the housing market in a way that disenfranchises working people.
Yeah, I was actually listening to a presentation from Safe Passage, which is a domestic violence shelter, and they're having difficulty securing housing for their victims. They're having to send them to Spokane, Washington, because they just cannot find the low-income housing. And their shelter is, it has a time limit because there's always people cycling in. And
I just did an interview with the Sandpoint Reader and had a really interesting conversation with the but one of the things we were talking about, like, people move, populations move about. That's part of kind of the human story, is moving populations. But I think about, like, what would it look like if we decided that the people who work in restaurants, they got to decide what our housing, what our developments look like, right? That it's not the developers' whole goal is to make money. And so they, of course, are going to build big houses where they can mark them up a lot, right? There's not a lot of money to be made in affordable housing. So, but like, what if we just rethought that, right? And I think one of the things I keep trying to push myself is to understand, like, part of this is a conceptual problem. We have accepted that this is maybe fighting, kicking and screaming, that this is like an acceptable way to organize our communities, that we have people in domestic violence situations who can't find housing, and 80% of the housing in a development is empty, right? Why did we accept that this is a reasonable way to run our communities? And what if we decided, like, nope, that's not reasonable anymore, and that we created tax codes or other systems that really incentivized what we want in our communities and disincentivized what we don't want in our communities? And I think those discussions, the problem is that often the people with power are also the same people who have the second home.
Yeah, it's funny because those kinds of questions, like what we want in our communities, and a lot of times, no, we don't want the low-income housing. But when I lived up at the Wandamere area up in Spokane County, for every so many, houses that went in, low-income housing, that developer had to put in an apartment complex. It was just kind of part of the deal. Mm-hmm. Where here in Idaho, the developer has to put in a park.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you don't want low-income people in your community, pay them more, then they won't be poor. I mean, it's like, these are not, I think that's one of the things that's frustrating for me. These are not complicated questions. They're just questions that the people who have the heart for them often don't have very much power to change things. But I think one of the things sociology can do, because it can't do a lot, but it can give names to problems. And when we can name problems, we can have collective discussions about them more effectively. So I think when we have a term like rural gentrification, it names it as a problem. It names kind of the power relations. And I think it makes things more visible and maybe allows people to work across political or class divides to see solutions to those. Maybe that's Pollyanna of me, probably, but it's my hope, at least.
I think that's a good one, because like it or not, I think everyone's going to these conversations are starting. I'm seeing them in the nonprofit world, and I think everyone's just going to have to come to the table, because the problem of, we don't have housing, and so the hospitality workers aren't living here, they're moving away, they're not taking those jobs, and now businesses are closed because there's nobody to work. And that's
I mean, it is interesting that this is, my mom's still in Sandpoint, and she's involved in the restaurant industry, and so she's been lamenting all these things. It's like, yeah, the chickens eventually come home to roost. You can't create communities that are deeply unequal and expect them to thrive.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're starting to see that. So this is such a timely book. Like you say, somebody from New York is calling.
So timely. I wish it wasn't so timely. It kind of makes me sad, but it is. Yeah.
And you started it, 5 years ago. So, and yeah, and now we see it. Why didn't you finish it? I'm kidding.
Because I have 3 children.
I hear that. I don't see any other questions. Heather Brandstetter says Idaho passed a law making it very hard to regulate short-term rentals. So again, with the
they also had passed a law right when the community of Dover was trying to figure out how to create their city beach, which is like a whole chapter in the book. It's really sad. They were trying to use systems and the county commissioners were working with them. They were going to try and make the beach a public beach. And the Supreme Court passed a law, and right when they were in the middle of it, that was like, oh, there's no way to do it now. So the state of Idaho does make it really challenging. And what it doesn't make sense to me is that, the people I'm interviewing, I think, would be horrified by these laws, and yet there's a disconnect between kind of who we elect, what they're passing, and who it benefits. Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't see any more questions, and you were ticking mine off as you were giving your presentation. Okay. So I think, with the 20-second delay, I've been watching, but I think that we're probably good to wrap up. And right, I would like to thank everyone for watching live, or if you're watching this recorded, thank you for tuning in. And this is a book that is available right now. It's on Amazon, and it's at local bookstores too, right? You said it's at the Well-Read Moose. Mm-hmm. And the museum and the Bonner Museum is working on getting some copies in our gift shops. But
and if you're in Sandpoint, Vanderford's has copies, and I'm actually doing a book signing this Saturday, May 22nd, from noon to 2.
All right, wonderful. Oh, everyone is saying thank you so much for writing this. I'm looking forward to reading it. Thank you so much for doing this book and the presentation. So yes, thank you. Thank you for doing this program with the museum. And we're so excited for your book. And you have an article, I think, coming out in the Inlander and Sandpoint Reader. Did that one come out already?
Yep, that one came out today. And I think there's something coming out maybe in Sandpoint Magazine. So.
Oh, wonderful. Yay. So yes, you guys can run out and grab your copy now. It is published this month. People from New York are reading it and calling us, so we got to do that too.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I've got to figure out